All right, for more on that, we're joined now by ActionSA Eastern Cape chairperson, Athol Trollip. Good to have you, and thank you very much for your time and coming on tonight.
Thank you very much for your time and giving it to us to speak to your viewers.
So let's talk about what has just happened according to your X page in the last 30 minutes. Education policy has been adopted. What does it entail? I heard the leader of ActionSA saying a little bit earlier on that he likes clever blacks because he wants educated black people, unlike other parties. So how different is your policy on education to what we have currently?
Well, look, I think it's significantly different because, as you've just said, our president wants to encourage young people to become clever blacks, as opposed to another political party that's in government that derides clever blacks. But what was really interesting about the debate this evening on education was the fact that, you know, this policy conference has been quite unique for me. I've been in politics for nearly 40 years now. And my experience with policy conferences is that they generally top down. Somebody writes a policy at a national level, sends it to the provinces. They have a look at it, and they come and rubber stamp it at a conference. My experience has been that for the last 4 months, there's been incredible interaction with all the provinces, all the regions in this whole country, and people have had inputs. They've made drafts. They've submitted them to Senate. They've gone back in draft format. And then people have made amendments, and we've had incredible debates this evening. I think what sets our education policy apart from the current government policy is that we spend a lot of time talking about access to better education at basic education level and tertiary level. We've seen what's happened to our tertiary institutions in this country. Almost everyone is bedeviled by maladministration. In Fort Hare in the Eastern Cape, for example, people are being murdered, they're being assassinated. Corruption has almost destroyed our institutions of higher learning. Billions of rands have gone missing for NSFAS funding that is intended for poor students. So essentially we're saying we should be paying teachers and lecturers better because we need people competent people with skills to teach the next generation. We need to keep the unions out of the classrooms. We need to bring back school inspectors so that the education that's taking place is viable education. And we are saying that you mustn't progress children who haven't passed. If you can't read or if you can't do the alphabet, you won't be able to write a sentence. And if you can't do that, you shouldn't progress to the next level. Yeah. And this government is progressing children that can't read and write to the next level of education. And they are not able to pass in institution of higher learning. Yeah. We also said that we should bring back vocational training and also the reintroduction of technical schools, because there is a real dearth of vocational training and technical skills in this country. And one of the people who spoke last was an amazing guy who started at a technical school and ended up with an accounting degree. But he said that even after he'd left school, he went back to the same school to get training, to get a Code 14 driver's license. And those are the kind of institutions that we have to bring back into this country. And he said we should not be fixing things that are not wrong. Obviously, everything that is wrong about the past needs to be fixed. But just simply changing everything for the sake of change has really cost us enormously in education in this country.
So I assume that with you in governance, the pass rate is not going to be 30%.
It is impossible to progress children on 30%. I mean, it's really ridiculous because all the current government's been doing is to try and breastbeat about having a 78 or 80% pass rate. You should never pass any subject with anything less than 50%. And the greatest travesty is that people are passing and getting matrics who shouldn't be getting matrics. But the worst thing is that we are losing hundreds of thousands of learners from those that enter school at grade 1 and those that supposed to leave school in grade 12. We have the greatest attrition rate of any other country in the world. People are leaving school because the education system is so poor, and poor people can't afford to go to better schools. So they're stuck in this quagmire of being given inferior education that holds them back and keeps them dependent. And it's almost as if this is being done by design by the current government, because they almost really rely on South Africans being dependent on the government. And we in ActionSA are entirely opposed to that. We say that people should be educated and capacitated to not be dependent on a government that's going to throw them bare bones. We believe we should capacitate people so that they can look after themselves, and that we won't be breastfeeding on having 28 million people surviving or miserably on grants. We believe that we will celebrate every million less that we have existing on grants. And that's what sets us apart from the government of the day.
So let's talk a little bit more about the hot button issues, because I can see that the financial scheme or student financial aid scheme has been kicked for touch. You've left it to the students to go and discuss and come back with a comprehensive model. I suppose you would have met the same kind of debate from the students around missing middle, and ActionSA hasn't got the handle also on how actually to deal with that.
Yeah, I think it's not that we don't have the handle on it. This is a really crucial aspect. We've seen 7 billion rand of NSFAS funding go unaccounted for under Braden Zamande, and we don't want to be part of that. So there have been some really sound proposals made by especially young people who find themselves in this kind of education quagmire in the tertiary sector. They've come up with some really sound proposals. What we've done is said that these must go and be checked against real audited numbers, so that we don't make commitments that we can't meet, and that we don't go through a process where years later we can't account for 7 billion rands worth of NSFAS funding. So we're a responsible party. We liked the amendments that were brought. There was unanimity about the amendment. What we've said is we're going to give a certain time period for the party to go and do proper research and get the numbers right, and come back and endorse it at a later stage. We're not in a hurry to pass these policies, and if we're not 100% happy with the policy amendment, we've got to make sure that we can go and do the research and we can make it implementable, because we've got wonderful policies in this country, but wonderful financial policies in this country. All falls flat when it comes to implementation and application, and we don't want to make ourselves guilty of that. So we'd rather take a few extra weeks and make sure we have a proper model that's not going to take this country down the drain. It's going to take the country forward, especially our future generation.
Interesting, 2 significant amendments that were unanimously supported by ActionSA on economic prosperity, which I look at them, and there are 6 more. You'll tell us the other 6 amendments, but let's talk about these particular 2. Of course, we are talking about the question of hijacked buildings now, so that would be quite topical. But unanimously, you as ActionSA support treating hijacking of buildings as treason. I wonder how that debate is going to go with the rest of the other parties. But even more interesting for me is the destruction of infrastructure during public protests, saying you want some stringent legislation to curb that. I can see people saying, well, ActionSA, firstly, you want to get rid of unions at schools, but 2, you also want to curb the right that is enshrined in the Constitution to strike.
No, you're absolutely wrong. Let me help you right there. First of all, we don't want to get rid of unions at schools. We're saying that we want to get rid of unions in the classroom. Teachers have every right in the Constitution to have union representation and be members of unions. No problem with that. What we're saying is there's no place for unionism in the classroom. Teachers should be in the classroom teaching children. I want to get that straight. Secondly, with regard to taking away the right to strike and protest, there was not one word of that mentioned today, not one word of it. We were saying that when there is protest action or strike action that results in destruction of public infrastructure, that there should be stringent legislation around taking responsibility for the destruction of public infrastructure. Now, we're very strong about law and order. We are not apologetic about bringing back law and order in this country. Law and order has become a real crisis in South Africa. We've seen what's happened to our crime statistics. We've seen that we've become the rape and murder capital of the whole world, and we've had enough of that. But what we're saying is, if you want to strike, if you want to protest, and then you want to burn down schools or burn buses or burn tires on roads or break public infrastructure, we're going to hold the striking organization or institution to account, and we're going to make you pay for that infrastructure. And then the last one about hijacked buildings. We've agreed to make the issue of hijacking of buildings, whether they're state-owned or privately owned buildings, an act of economic sabotage or treason, economic treason. Now, that's a very important statement to make, because we believe implicitly in the right to own property, and we don't believe any person, body or institution has the right to take your property away from you and hijack it and run it for their own ends or means. So we're very clear about that. And if you do that, we are going to punish you with a law equitable to treason.
Which would be discussed. But let's come back to that question of the economy and how you see the question of the economy. One would say one thing certainly that might not be a challenge for you in terms of your partnership with the Democratic Alliance is the scrapping of BEE, right? And what do you suggest be put in the place of that to address issues of redress?
Well, look, first of all, we fundamentally differ with the DA's position on broad-based black economic empowerment. I think the only similarity is that we believe that broad-based black economic empowerment has failed under the current government. It has failed miserably. All it's done is empower a few connected people. Good cadres in the ANC have benefited from it. So I think if there's any unanimity on that, it's around the fact that it's failed. We in ActionSA believe that you can't be colorblind. We have a history in this country. We have a painful history in this country, and it was pretty much determined around color. So we believe strongly in redressing that historical past, the painful historical past of exclusion and oppression of people based on their color. And we believe that we can't be blind to the lived realities of the generations of people that came after those that had to live during apartheid and dispossession. So we're very, very strong on that. But what we're saying is that we need a new system to empower all South Africans of all persuasions who were prejudiced by the legislation of the past based on color. And I think that's where we are separated completely from what the Democratic Alliance believes. But this is about ActionSA. This is about what we're going to do when we're in government, about making sure that every penny or cent spent on redressing the past and dealing with the lived realities of people who have to deal with prejudice and oppression and dispossession is effective, and that ultimately it brings people out of poverty. For example, if you look at some of the legislation in this country around property ownership, one of our presenters today, one of our guest speakers, Leon Lowe, was saying there is still huge amounts of apartheid legislation that is still enacted in this country that prevents people owning property. He gave an example of Sandton in one hand, where almost every piece of property is either owned or leased or held in some kind of secure tenure, and right next door to it in Alexandra, we've got people who no property is owned or leased or rented in Alexandra. So people who live in Alexandra live there illegally on land that doesn't belong to anybody, and that is completely untenable, and it will have to be changed. We believe strongly in that you can only redress the past by giving people ownership of what they own, land or property or whatever it is, that they have secure title, tenure, or a long-term lease on the land that they live on. Without that, you will never get economic prosperity, and that's what we are talking about today.
Right. And the draft policy document around the ownership of land suggests that you as ActionSA are against state ownership of land. You're saying as it inhibits economic growth. What do you suggest then would be a way of redistributing land to those who were dispossessed of their land unlawfully?
Well, first of all, we're not against the state owning land. What we are totally against is nationalization of land. Some political parties believe that the state should own all the land. We've seen what happens when that happens. We've seen it in our neighboring country in Zimbabwe. So we are totally opposed to nationalization of land. The state does own land. The state is probably the biggest landowner in South Africa. And we believe that there's lots of scope for the state to transfer that land to beneficiaries of land reform and also land transformation and rural development and agrarian reform. So we believe that there is enough land that is owned by the state that can be transferred to beneficiary communities and individuals, and that transfer must be done with a secure form of tenure that then can be used to leverage some capital funding that is sorely required in any kind of agricultural or rural development. You can eke out a subsistence existence on land that doesn't belong to you in a rural area, but you can never become commercially viable and competitive unless you have access to capital, and you can never get access to capital unless you have secure tenure or a long-term lease. And that's the bottom line for ActionSA. We believe that that's where real land reform and transformation should be taking place. The state should be transferring land that it holds in its ownership to the hands of the people that live on it and work the land.
How different is your universal basic income stimulus to the basic income grant that, for example, the likes of COSATU and the others have been calling for?
Well, look, what we're saying is that this system of grant dependency that's been foisted onto South Africans by the ANC government is simply not sustainable. The Minister of Finance, Enoch Godongwana, has been cautioning the government that it's not sustainable, and that if they want to continue with this COVID funding of 350 Rand a month to poor South Africans who are out of work, to me, it's a complete insult to give somebody who's impoverished 350 Rand a month. But even that is unsustainable. So what we're saying is we should be looking at initiatives that give people who are out of work or maybe are unemployed graduates, that we should give them an incentive for a couple of years to get them going, to start entrepreneurship programs, or to use that money wisely to get themselves ahead and get a job, or use the money to be able to go into town, to apply for jobs, to do all the red tape kind of bureaucracy that is required of people to get a job. And rather do that and invest more for a shorter period of time and get people onto their feet than have people depending forever on a 350 Rand grant, which isn't sustainable at the moment. The ANC are starting to discover that at their great peril on the eve of the next election, because you simply cannot have 28 million people depending on the largesse of the state, because the state's pie is getting smaller and smaller. Our economy is not growing, so our tax pool is not growing. Therefore, the ANC government can't carry on just handing out grants and encouraging people to be dependent on them. So we're saying we much rather would create a new generation of South Africans that are independent, that we're going to give them a hand up and not a hand out for the rest of their lives. And I think that's what differentiates us from the ANC.
Yeah. You speak of something called an opportunity fund. How different is that opportunity fund, for example, to what the economic freedom fighters would have called a sovereign wealth fund, which they believe would be able to effectively redistribute wealth and stimulate growth?
Well, first of all, you've got to have wealth to have a wealth fund for redistribution. And under the policies of the EFF, there certainly won't be any wealth in this country. We believe that this opportunity fund is an opportunity and an incentive for government and private taxpayer individuals to be motivated to invest in this, and that it should be run like, independently from the government. It shouldn't be open to greedy people in government to get their paws into it. It should be administered on behalf of the country, like any other investment funds are administered on behalf of pensioners and that kind of thing, and that money would generate income, and that would be, it's like, let's say, a trust fund or a bursary scheme at a school. There's an initial investment, it generates interest, it's ongoing, it's managed properly, the money is invested properly, and it keeps giving back so that you can give more kids an opportunity through a bursary scheme. So it's a similar kind of initiative of opportunity, but you also incentivize taxpayers to make contributions towards that. It's their corporate social investment in this country, and we believe that will be much more significant than simply giving people grants out of the fiscus.
Your position on your immigration system that should be used, was it widely adopted? Were some amendments suggested on that to deepen it or maybe even make it better?
Yeah, look, it's a very topical subject, and it's quite interesting how it's gone from being xenophobic, an untouchable topic, to a very topical subject that most political parties are talking about. Herman Mashaba was probably a pioneer in this thing, and he's been consistent from the start. He says that he recognizes, and so do we as ActionSA recognize, that this country was built on the back of migrants from all over the world who brought skills and expertise to come and build this country. So we believe that we live in a global village, and we encourage migration, especially if they bring scarce and special skills. But you have to be documented. You have to come through a legal process to be a migrant or an immigrant in this country. If you don't do that, there's no place for you here. For example, if you commit a crime and you're undocumented, you haven't gone through any kind of formal border processing as an individual coming into this country, there's no fingerprints, there's no track record of who you are. So even if there is a crime scene and a weapon is detected with fingerprints on it, you can never get to the owner of those fingerprints. So we're saying you're welcome to come into this country as long as you're here legally. If you're here illegally and unlawfully, we're going to send you back to where you came from, and you can reapply to come through legally. It's as simple as that. It's about sovereign, independence, and we believe as South Africa we have the right to sovereign independence, but we also believe that in a global village, people come from all over the world. They move around with their skills and trade those skills, and we don't want to deter that. We want to actually encourage it, but you must be here legally.
Yeah. How do you see the outcomes of this policy conference complementing, or maybe even in some instances interfering with the multi-party charter for South Africa? You seem to have signed the agreement ahead of the policy conference. What happens when the outcomes of this are vastly different to what you've agreed upon?
No, look, I don't think there's any problem there, because, the other parties that have also signed the multi-party charter, many of them have already had their policy conferences. They haven't changed their policies. We're not going to change our policies because we've signed a multi-party charter. In fact, it's one of the fundamental principles of the multi-party charter that we will contest these elections as independent, standalone political parties. We're going to take our different offerings to the electorate, and we believe that makes us collectively stronger, because, in South Africa we have what we call enclave politics, or niche political parties that represent specific interests. And we believe that if we have a number of those kind of political parties participating in a multi-party charter, each one can bring whatever it can bring, and that the sum of the whole will be greater than the sum of the parts. So our policy conference will have absolutely no impact on the multi-party charter that we signed. In fact, I think it'll make it stronger, because we can now take our policies at the conclusion of this process to South Africans, and every one of the people that have been in this policy process are campaigners. They are activists on the ground. They'll be engaging South Africans and saying, this is how we're going to address these 11 priority areas that we've identified that really affect South Africans on a day-to-day basis, and we'll be campaigning on those. And I believe we'll come up with a policy suite that's going to resonate with South Africans, and that more and more South Africans will see us as an alternative, and that will make the policy, the multi-party charter even stronger. The stronger the ActionSA is, the stronger the multi-party charter is. And we believe that we will emerge from this election as the second biggest party in South Africa. And I think once this policy conference is concluded, South Africans will see that we're a serious political party. Someone said today that we're a new political party. We're not a small political party. And South Africans are going to see after this election that we're not a small political party. We're a new political party in South Africa that's offering South Africans something completely fresh and new. And I think it's going to have strong resonance right across this country.
Athol Trollip, as always. Gabriela Mshegas, thanks so much for coming on. That is ActionSA leader in the Eastern Cape there, Athol Trollip.